Hello, I'm Angie Perrone, and today we're going to talk about qualitative methods. So for this module, we're going to go through an overview of what qualitative methods is. We're also going to individually discuss some of the more common types of qualitative methods. For example, we'll talk about ethnography, we'll talk about interviews, focus groups, we'll talk about case studies, and narrative research. And then we'll talk about some key questions and some common mistakes to avoid when looking at research that's qualitative in nature. So to get started, what is qualitative research? So qualitative research tends to be more inductive in nature. And what I'm going to do through this module is I'm going to talk about some of the differences between qualitative and quantitative research, just to give you some emphasis on what qualitative research really is and how you can better understand it. So as inductive research, what does that mean? So inductive research basically is the type of research that is looking at a general problem. It looks at a puzzle. It doesn't come to the research with a predetermined hypothesis. It's more iterative in process. So a researcher who's doing qualitative research is more likely going to collect data, review the data, look for themes and concepts that become the basis for theory. Qualitative research generally tends to develop theory as opposed to testing a theory. In contrast, quantitative research tends to be more deductive, which means that it usually has a predetermined hypothesis that it then tests based on an already existing theoretical framework. So for quantitative researchers, they tend to collect data to reveal how the theory applies, or perhaps does not apply, to a social phenomenon. Quantitative research usually prefers random or systematic sampling, for example. Quantitative research also tends to generalize, or someone who uses quantitative research can often generalize their results to a broader population, whereas qualitative research generally is more theory generating and less able to generalize to the general population. Quantitative research often involves a large number of cases. Qualitative research tends to have fewer number of cases. Quantitative research also tends to use statistical models to draw inferences about the cases and reveal what factors may have produced an outcome. So you'll also see a difference in some of the questions asked, the types of questions asked between qualitative and quantitative research. So quantitative research tends to ask the questions what or how many. So for example, what factors best predict suicide among teens who are bullied? Is it race? Is it gender, income, social support, or a variety of these factors together? How many teens who are bullied commit suicide? So that is going to be looking at more of a numbers response. Whereas qualitative research is really not aimed to establish or predict the cause of something. Instead, it's more focused on processes, detailed contextual or historical descriptions. It looks at the meanings or interpretations and explanations that people assign to events, activities, and behaviors. So qualitative questions are less likely to produce information that's going to be generalizable to the population as a whole. With qualitative research, you're more likely to be able to investigate something that's complex and involves a little bit more nuance and in-depth analysis. So you'll see questions more like why, how, or under what circumstances. So in contrast to the previous example, the quantitative example of how many, or what, we would ask why do some bullied teens or teens who are bullied commit suicide? What are the processes at play? So you might, in the quantitative research, you might actually hand out a survey, and you would want to get survey responses to determine how many teenagers in a particular area have committed suicide who have been bullied, or how many teenagers in a particular area have identified the experiences they have as bullying. Whereas in qualitative research, we might want to know more. We might interview students to find out what are they thinking in their heads when they're experiencing what we might call bullying? Do they see it as bullying? How are they internalizing it? And these are things that are easier to capture through qualitative research. And they also help generate theories and understand the processes at play. So now I want to talk a little bit about the differences between method and methodology. So you'll come across these words when you're looking at research articles that you can use in your practice, but you want to know the differences between method and methodology, because a lot of articles you'll read will use these terms interchangeably, but they do really mean something slightly different. One note I want to add is that different disciplines also use some of these words, or these words, slightly differently as well. So I'm going to give you just kind of a general overview of the differences broadly, especially as it pertains to qualitative methods or qualitative research. So for qualitative methods, a method is generally a tool that it's a way to describe what the researcher has done in terms of its tools. So examples might be ethnography, interviews, focus groups. Are you using documents? Are you talking to people? And I'll get more in depth at what an ethnography is in a minute. But basically, it's what is the researcher doing to answer a particular question to understand a social phenomenon. Now, methodologies are a little bit different. Methodologies are really, what are the principles that are driving the research and the research methods? How is the researcher conceptualizing how he or she should go about conducting that research? So for example, several methodologies include grounded theory. And I have a whole separate session on grounded theory, mostly just because it's so popular and common in qualitative research. Action research is another potential methodology. This is an area where some people refer to it as a methodology, some people refer to it as a method, but it depends on, is it being used as a tool to conduct the research, or is it being perceived as a principle driving the research? For example, are we thinking about our research as something that we're doing? Are we using action-oriented tools to understand a phenomenon? Or are we using theoretical designs or theories based on action that are driving the research itself? So that would be the differences there. Ethnomethodology is another type of methodology, which we'll talk a little bit about a little bit later. So now ethnography. Let's learn a little bit about ethnography. So in this session, I'm going to talk about the basic principles of ethnography. We're going to talk about some of the advantages, some of the constraints of using ethnography. I'm going to talk about ways that you can evaluate the quality of ethnography research, and specifically how you can use ethnographic research in your social work practice. So now for ethnography, here are some basic principles. So ethnography tends to be a qualitative method that involves studying people in their natural settings, as opposed to a controlled environment. So natural settings, what does that mean? It basically means that you are actually, or the researcher is actually going to an environment, embedding themselves in that environment, immersing themselves in a particular situation or phenomenon to understand a group's culture and provide in-depth understanding of everyday life and practice. So they're observing and they're documenting what they're observing, sometimes moment to moment, or maybe at the end of the day. There's different ways that people do this, but they're really trying to make sure that they're making sense of what they're seeing and what they're observing. So for example, think about if you've been to an airport, and you might, if you're an ethnographer, well, as a flyer, you know, we go to an airport, we look at flights, we look at the flight scanners, we're doing things to get ourselves to our next destination, right? But if you imagine yourself, and you might be thinking of questions, just, is my flight on time? Is it delayed? Things like that. So if you're an ethnographer and you're interested in a research project about how flight customers or travelers are making sense of or understanding what happens when their flight is delayed. So a quantitative researcher might hand out a survey and get a sense of all the people at the airport, how many people had their flights delayed, and sort of some of the more mechanics of that, and what predicts how flights are delayed, or what predicts when flights are delayed, what predicts when people are going to be upset when flights are delayed. A qualitative researcher instead will come in and look at so an ethnographer in particular is going to come in and look at what are people actually doing when a flight is delayed? Are they getting really upset? Because in a survey, someone might say, I was really upset and I left. But what you might see in ethnography is you might see, yes, the person whose flight was delayed was exceptionally upset, but then something else interesting happened. And instead of getting upset and then leaving, what they actually did was they spent some time talking to their loved ones. They spent some time doing something else that suggests maybe they had other emotions besides anger. And you might not be able to capture that in a survey or even an interview if you are relying solely on what the person themselves perceives about what happened. Because maybe there are things that they did or other things that happened in the circumstance that they're not even aware of. So ethnography is going to capture that. Ethnography tends to be a long-term fieldwork process. So people that do ethnography, researchers that do ethnography, are often in the field, which is what we say when you're in an environment immersed trying to understand what people are doing. They're in the field for a long time. It's not just a one day. It's usually not just a one-day event. It shouldn't be a one-day event. There are probably some exceptions, but generally it tends to be something over multiple periods of time. And sometimes people will come back and forth to make sure that they've gotten a really good sense of an in-depth observation. So with questions that are focused, research questions for ethnography tend to be inductive, as qualitative research tends to be. And qualitative researchers that use ethnography focus on what happened. They might look at personal reflections. They'll also look at conversations that people might have. They review, this is just going through the process of ethnography. And while they're actually observing a phenomenon or an event, they're going to be taking detailed notes. And throughout this process, they're also better formulating the research question that they have at hand. So the themes, they're going to basically see themes emerge while they're observing various phenomenon, which will then further influence the way that they maybe make their observations. Maybe they decide that, okay, I've observed a group of people at this particular gate, and I've seen this, but I wonder if, and it's given me insight and theoretical richness that helps me decide that I want to now go to this other area to understand how, to understand how flyers in this particular gate or with this, different airline might envision what their options are after they've had a flight delay. There's also something called autoethnography. And you may come across some articles when you're looking at ethnography that refer to autoethnography. And autoethnography is basically a person who is creating or engaging in an ethnography of themselves. And it's different than a biography or an autobiography in that it involves more theoretical richness and actually uses theory to understand a phenomenon. So there's some controversy in the field about the benefits and use of autoethnography, but one area that I've seen it be fairly successful and quite useful is in healthcare in particular. So for example, if you have an individual who's experienced a very acute illness, so that's not something that an ethnographer is necessarily going to, they're not going to go to a hospital necessarily and wait for people to experience these, rare acute illnesses. I mean, they might, but it's going to be much more challenging. And then there are some ethical issues with that as well. It's certainly not an issue. The previous module focused on controlled experiments. You're certainly not going to have a controlled experiment where you give someone some rare acute illness and then observe it. So an autoethnography is a way to get some sort of research out of someone's personal experience that is something that maybe wasn't necessarily planned in advance. So I've seen autoethnography really successfully employed in pretty intense cancer circumstances, so severe and acute illness. So let me take a step back and talk a little bit more generally about the advantages and some of the disadvantages or constraints, really, about using ethnography to inform your research practice or your social work practice. So one of the big advantages of ethnography is that it illuminates what people do versus what they say they do. So in the example about flights, you might see things that people themselves don't really see that they're doing or think that they're doing. It captures data that self-reported information, such as interviews or sometimes surveys, may not capture. Some of the constraints of ethnography. It really only provides a slice of a phenomenon. You really can't generalize the observations to an entire population or other groups. You can get theory, and the researchers will develop theories about a phenomenon, but you can't say that I observed, so for example, I can't say I observed a bunch of people who were very angry about a flight delay from this particular airline on this particular day. Thus, all people who experience flight delays at all airlines are going to have a very similar experience. You just can't make that, you just can't make that conclusion. So there are some other issues with ethnography that arise that you want to be paying attention to if you're reading a research article about ethnography. And it involves ethics and how researchers who are doing ethnography are engaged in the field. So for example, how do they get informed consent? Do they talk about informed consent? If you're observing people, you generally are not going to have like flyers that you hand out, and you're not getting informed consent in the same way. If you're at a public space, generally informed consent is a little bit more freely given, in the sense that if you're at a public space, then people are in public spaces and they're doing things that are not considered to be necessarily private. But an ethnographer who goes into a more private space, like let's say I go to, I'm interested in studying healthcare behaviors. I can't go into a doctor's office without getting significant informed consent and observe patients' behavior without getting informed consent. And that's a really rigorous process as well. So you want to look at how's the researcher describing how they got informed consent. The other thing about ethnography is it really is impossible to not be influenced by one's own lenses. So a good ethnographer is going to make it very clear about how they thought about their own interpretations and how their own experiences have influenced how they have interpreted the situation that they're observing. Another area in ethnography that's can be a little tricky is that in most research, confidentiality is a very important concept. And so you want to really make sure that you're not producing harm or creating harm with the people or for the people that you are researching. So a lot of times researchers will provide fictitious names or change aspects about the participants that they're observing just to maintain confidentiality. So that can be tricky though with ethnography if you are observing a really specialized site, and it can be really tricky to maintain confidentiality. If there's only one of this particular organization in an entire state, it's pretty clear who you are observing. And so sometimes people will make some tweaks with participants. In addition to names, they'll tweak maybe the race or the gender, which can be problematic if that is an actual core concept of what shapes the observation. So when you're looking at research with ethnography, you want to pay attention to how the researcher is describing the methods essentially in which they're employing. And that'll help you kind of evaluate quality, is looking at the ethics of the researcher's methods itself. But another area, or another couple of things that you can do to evaluate the quality of a research article that uses ethnography is you want to look at, does the researcher engage in what's called reflexivity? So have they thought about their own experiences? Have they thought about how they themselves have, what they have brought to the experience, what they have brought to the research and their observations? How do their own personal experiences shape that, shape those observations? Is there a substantive contribution? I mean, I could go to the airport and I could just take a look and watch people, and that maybe not actually a substantive contribution. But if I'm actually going there with the intent, a method that's very thought out, and I'm generating theory and really using some in-depth, rigorous like method and process at play, that's more likely to be a contribution, as opposed to just sort of some general notes that I've jotted down. And this is a good way that you can evaluate really good ethnography and ethnography that is I would put in the needs improvement category, which is it something that just notes that someone's jotted down and then wrote a paper about, or is this something that actually was very thoroughly engaged and thought through? So now let's go through a hypothetical, or what some people might say a case study, to see how we can think about ethnography in a real-world example. All right, so I want you to imagine you are a medical social worker that specializes in cancer treatment. You work with older adults. While your medical clinic serves patients across several counties, including both rural and urban areas, you've noticed that most of your patients come from one county. This county tends to be more rural. Now, you want to understand what factors may be driving this disparity. So how can you use ethnographic research to help you? So take a moment to reflect on how you might use ethnographic research to help you with this particular case study. And then we'll circle back and think about it more collectively.